And now I am delighted to welcome our Executive Director of the Drake Group Education Fund, Julie Summer, who will
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Mazzy. The Drake Group Education Fund is dedicated to educating the public and professionals in our business with fact-based information, featuring the experts in our profession, so that we may all do a better job of helping college athletes realize the promise of an educational degree and becoming all they can be as students and athletes. So we welcome you to our 33rd webinar. If you have your calendars out, please save Thursday, March 28th, 2 weeks from now, for our next webinar, What is the Proper Role of the Press in Covering College Sports? We will also meet the winner of this year's 2024 Student Journalism Prize for investigative reporting on intercollegiate athletics, and the two runners-up who will tell us how they broke their stories for student newspapers. This type of investigative journalism has proven to be critical in breaking stories not related to game scores, stories that lead to holding powerful institutions accountable, while many college sports journalists, professional journalists, are hesitant to report on due to concerns about maintaining access to teams and coaches. Last but not least, please put April 18th on your calendars when we will hold the third Alan Sack National Symposium, The College Athlete, More Than a Marketplace, in Washington, D.C. at Howard University. Our nationally recognized moderators, David Steele, who's written for The Sporting News, Baltimore Sun, San Francisco Chronicle, and Newsday, Doug Letterman, the editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Education, and Jane McManus, an author and editor of Year's Best Sports Writing. Panelists are being finalized now. Just a glimpse. Michelle Roberts, the former NBA Players Association Executive Director, a practicing expert on player unions. Jeffrey Kessler of Winston Strawn, the lawyer litigating two multi-billion-dollar antitrust cases that could financially capsize college sport. And Arthur Bryant of Bailey Glasser, among the top Title IX litigators in the country, are just three great speakers featured in our program. We hope you can join us, but if you can't, please consider sponsoring a student to attend. Students in the local DC area majoring in sports law, sports management, and other sports-related fields. Each year, we raise enough funds to ensure that half of our symposium attendees are students attending at no charge, with preference to students attending lower resource institutions. I've asked Mazzy to post a link in the chat room if you'd like to help make a student attendance possible. Last, thank you to all of our panelists today for their time, expertise, and ideas. And thank you to you all for attending. Webinars provide us with the opportunity to share new ideas, recalibrate our thinking on issues, and get up to date on important topics. We are so pleased to have you join us. And I'm honored to introduce the moderator of today's program. Please meet Declan Hill, Associate Professor of Investigations, Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Science, University of New Haven, and a member of the Drake Group Education Fund Board of Directors. Thank you, Declan.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you, Mazzy, for that. Don't worry, I hadn't forgotten the housekeeping. I was just launching into a rhetorical flourish at that moment. So I'm glad you stopped me before I went too far. Look, part of the biography that some people may not know is that I've done my PhD at the University of Oxford, and as I was doing it, I infiltrated a gang of Asian match fixers who travel around the world, still now, fixing major international sporting tournaments and leagues around the world. So it's been with real interest that I came to the United States just as sports gambling was effectively legalized in May 14th, 2018, and discovered that there was not a very strong debate or conversation about this hugely important social phenomenon that was hitting all of North America, both Canada, Mexico, the United States, right across, was kind of throwing the doors open to this new phenomenon of legal, publicly available, and in many cases not, but in many cases, unregulated sports gambling. New voices have to be heard. Voices that show the full perspective of what's happening to our societies, what's happening to our post-secondary educational institutions. So that's why I've invited the panelists today, because they have different voices than most of the people that you've heard so far in this discussion. They're going to be talking about robust research. They're going to be talking about real critical situations that are actually happening in real life. One housekeeping note. We respect you. Everybody who's sitting at home or in their office or on their phones, we know that we're supposed to start on time. We almost did that. We were just a couple of minutes late. and then we're going to finish on time. This is not going to be one of those Zubinars that go on like a long day's journey into night, and we're going into this thing. We have 4 very distinguished panelists. I'm going to give each of them 12 minutes. They are brilliant people, and I want you to hear everything they have to say. So gentlemen, halfway through your panel, I'm going to do one of those kind of motions, or I'm going to raise my phone in that particular way. I mean, no disrespect to you guys. I really am very honored that you would be here, but I want to make sure that all the panelists have the right and sufficient amount of time. Then I'll give you a 1-minute warning, and then I'll stop you with many, many apologies. I know that you have a lot to say, and there's no way that you're going to be able to cover your expertise and experience in 12 minutes, but I want to make sure that we're respectful to everybody and also to the people who are listening and watching us. I've got written down on my notes, Ted Lasso. For those of you who haven't seen Apple TV's brilliant show about an American coach who lands up in England, bringing an American perspective to a very English sport and a very English culture, our first guest in this panelist is essentially the Ted Lasso of organized crime. Nicholas Radinsky is a former Homeland Security agent who fought long, hard, and in an intense way against narco traffickers in Colombia and Mexico and around the world. He then joined the fight against international match fixing with FIFA, the world organization that that organizes soccer. Then he joined UEFA. Now he's the head of intelligence at the International Testing Agency, the International Olympic Committee run agency for rooting out doping and anti-corruption in those sports. So he's an American who has had over the last 10 years an immense amount of experience in the global world. So I've asked Nicholas to come here to share his perspective on what's happening outside North America in this international globalized sports gambling world as a way into the discussion about what is happening now at American universities. Nick, it's an absolute honor to have you here. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Declan. First of all, I'm very pleased to take this opening intervention to try to set the scene for this critical issue. What you're going to hear for the next 12 minutes is what I can only warn you as being a warning from the future. This is a factual account of what could happen if we don't separate fact from fiction on gambling, betting monitoring, enforcement, investigations, intelligence, and prevention and education for athletes. We're here to examine ways to minimize the pending catastrophe. This is not a fictional tale, but instead I would like to tell you about the lack of enforcement related to match fixing on a global scale. This is a factual account of a $1.35 trillion global betting market and the fixing of hundreds and hundreds of soccer matches throughout the world. What has been labeled as a tsunami of fixing. We basically cannot find a sport across the globe that hasn't been subject to fixing on a global scale, especially on the Asian market. And now I'm going to tell you about unfettered, regular, and rampant fixing across European soccer. And on average, we had about 35,000 top tier matches and about 450 betting alerts throughout that season. This grew into an entirely reactive situation where, without adequate resources or a lack of will to tackle the problem head on, we really face significant problems. Without proper enforcement or uniform investigations, this was unchecked for a number of years, and the problem continued to metastasize. Further, what we observed was small teams developing their match fixing skills in small competitions. Small preseason games with less scrutiny, less availability on the betting markets, and even fewer fans in the stands watching the games. And most importantly, no video feed to show the antics online. But sometimes this would evolve into those same teams going into higher or regional competitions, especially where the betting markets grew to be as big as one can imagine. They would qualify for top tier competitions such as the Champions League or European Cup. They would be widely available for betting, resoundingly attended by fans, and huge from a risk perspective in Asia. And now when it comes to sponsorship and marketing, the lucrative TV deals and the top brand sponsorship, what we witnessed was big soccer leagues across the globe start to lose sponsorship deals due to fixing, corruption, or integrity, or even worse, reputational issues. We watched as those top teams in big countries played in front of very few fans because there was such disbelief at the fairness and the sporting product that was being put onto the field of play. Therefore, this is a story of weak governance and a lack of enforcement, of an unchecked problem that occurred for decades, unchecked fixing from inside the sport. Asian gambling syndicates and match fixers spread their tentacles throughout the networks of this sport. Lack of enforcement by the governing bodies included non-enforcement of its own rules, no gambling related activity by its members or officials. And we saw a global gambling market with gambling sponsorship from opaque origins or outright offshore front companies emblazoned across jerseys, advertising boards surrounding the pitch, practically enticing the players themselves into betting. So I want to talk a little bit about the volume of gambling alerts. We were talking about 400, 450 betting alerts provided by betting monitoring companies. And these were monitoring that was detected on the regulated gambling market. Therefore, we're not talking about underground or unregulated markets, back alleys. We're talking about sponsored, well-known, well-documented, regulated gambling markets. And I've seen ludicrous amount of matches suggested to be suspicious, upwards of 1,000, which I feel this tactic is a little bit of scaremongering to try to force sport into doing something about it. But reading from a recent report, the world's most popular sport for betting, which is soccer, continues to be the most affected with over 800 suspicious matches, followed by basketball with over 200 matches. And so therefore, those over 800 matches in soccer and over 200 matches in basketball does not mean that there were credible, tangible investigations into those matches. So we have this situation of unchecked, unmitigated gambling fixing, global betting availability, and a lack of enforcement from the governing body. And further, the lack of controls of influence of organized crime figures and match fixers into the top echelons of club, team management, owners, and even worse for us, the players themselves. And here was the major problem. The corrupted players themselves became the most dynamic fixers. They knew the business, they knew what it was like to be without money, and they knew what it was like to be able to exploit other players to fix. And so let's shift away from European soccer to the United States. And here's a quick story. The year is 1989. It's March Madness time, just like it is now. The nation's captivated by the next Cinderella story, dancing through March Madness. In particular, 1989, that was my beloved university, Seton Hall. Their storied run to the Final Four. Championship game. Thank you. Championship game against Michigan. And the betting line for that game is Michigan -2. Now, why in 1989, if betting is illegal across the United States, does a young kid, a young teenager like me, know the betting line for the national championship game? Why is it that for dozens of years, which until the legalization of sports betting across the US, were newspapers publishing the betting lines? When we flipped over the sports pages in the 80s and 90s, the papers across the nation would carry this point spread. And if we as kids knew the betting lines, the officials knew it. Certainly the players knew it as well. And without a doubt, the figures from organized crime knew it even better. At that point, everybody knew a guy in the street that could get a bet on if you wanted to, legal or not. And gambling in sports, therefore, has been here, not only just in Las Vegas, but it's been here then, and it's been here even more so now with the move into a regulated and digital arena in America. So I want to explain to you a little bit about the size of the problem. Imagine you have a bowling ball, a bathtub, and a swimming pool. So imagine, if you can for a moment, to understand the size of the betting market, understand the volume of bets on the regulated, monitored markets. This bowling ball represents the match fixing or organized crime syndicates' money going on to the betting market. That bathtub, let's say, for example, is the regulated US gambling market. And now I throw that bowling ball into the bathtub. It's going to create waves. That's simple to detect. Now, if I were to take that same bowling ball, throw it into a swimming pool, into an even bigger market, there would be less of a splash, comparatively speaking. Now, if I throw that bowling ball into the lake, say Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, for those Canadians joining us, or Lake Erie, a Pennsylvania guy like me, there is even less of a detectable ripple. And further, if I take that bowling ball, the very same betting that was going onto the market, and I break it up into 100 different pieces, and I throw those pieces like pebbles into the lake in a slow, controlled way, not to make waves, not to make a splash, there's no chance that those waves are even being registered or detected. And that's a symbol for what the waves that are being detected and reported by betting monitoring. They may not know why there was a wave, why there was a drop, why there was a shift in the line or a significant move, but they know that the line and the market move to money going on the market. It's these detectable movements that betting monitoring is reporting. So I just want to be clear, betting monitoring is not a silver bullet. Any organized crime syndicate, any complicated betting scheme will try to avoid such detection. And so I guarantee there are ways that they're actively looking to avoid waves or splashes. We spoke very briefly with match fixers that have described different betting strategies to avoid detections, to avoid betting large suspicious betting moves. So what I can say is that we're up against a significant threat from money being put on the gambling market in a slow and steady technique in a way that cannot be detected. So moving on to the problem of student athletes and the perspective of problem gambling, this is one of the biggest problems that the sport is facing, certainly within college athletics. Now, the student athlete themselves, they require academic support services through education, through awareness, and through prevention in order to deter this activity. But gambling addictions are already underway, and the student athletes are firmly within the crosshairs of organized crime. And therefore, we have to come up with concrete solutions to address the problem, the plague of problem gambling. These semi-professional athletes, such as those in lower leagues, minor leagues, developmental leagues, as well as unpaid amateur athletes, are ultra high risk, the top of the top. So if we put this all into context, we were talking about large, global, unfettered, and unchecked match fixing across professional sports, with professional referees being corrupted, professional players. What are we going to do when it's an 18 to 20-year-old kid from a low-income house trying to find his way through the world? These student athletes stand no chance without the tools and the understanding of the scope and the size of the problem. So in conclusion, we can agree that the US or North American sports markets are indeed different from European soccer. But I wanted to give you a warning from the future that if college sports goes the way of European soccer, with low paid athletes, lack of prevention, lack of awareness, a high availability on the gambling market, and a lack of enforcement or investigations, a steady rise of unchecked and unenforced betting alerts. This is the impending catastrophe which is ahead of us. And finally, as a reminder, betting monitoring can only take us so far. We have to dissuade those from thinking that this is a silver bullet, that all we need is to detect match fixing, point shaving, or gambling. We need a comprehensive approach with both education and enforcement. Because simply put, I've seen this movie before and I know how it ends. Hopefully, my intervention has set us up for an earnest conversation on what's facing us. Thank you.
Nick, thank you very much. I love your measured tones about describing what you speak of as the impending catastrophe, the movie that you've seen before in your experience as an organized crime fighter around the world. I will share a quick anecdote before we get to one of the world's experts on gambling addiction. And that is that when I visited one of the top Asian bookmakers in the world, it was a slow night. They had one game of soccer featuring 15-year-olds, so not even university players, but 15-year-olds, and there was $4 million on that game. 4 million. Think of the effect of that would have on, forget the 15-year-olds, on the average parent of those 15-year-olds. Take a moment now, swing our attention over to the issue of addiction. And when you speak about young addiction in terms of gambling across North America, there's one name that comes off, and that is Jeffrey Darowensky of the McGill University, who has spent years, decades, doing systemic, robust, data-driven research on the effects of sports gambling and all gambling on young people, but specifically with American universities, specifically with the NCAA. So it's a great honor to have an academic with such credentials coming on and speaking to us. Jeffrey, thank you for taking the time. I know that you are going to do a brief PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to talk and whiffle on as Mazzy makes you a host. Let me know, guys, when you're ready to go.
Thank you very much, Declan.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Okay, I see you're a host now.
Okay.
While you're sorting out, Jeff, I just want to drop in people's minds the recent controversy coming out of the Temple Loyola basketball matches. For those of you that haven't seen those newspaper articles and those media stuff, Temple and Loyola have been, their tier one men's basketball teams have been red flagged on the betting market as having unusually high swings. We're going to be talking to Tim about that. We're going to be talking to Nick about that again, and in terms of what that actually means, whether that's actually particularly suspicious, whether that's what kind of red flag that is. But that is one subject that we'll be returning to. Jeffrey, are you ready to go, brother?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can access it, but let me see what's happening here. I'll share screen. Okay.
And we're also, while you're doing this, Jeffrey, we've been plagued by some technological problems. We have one of North America's top pro gamblers, the PhD Ed Fang, who's frantically trying to join us. He's been sending me emails and text messages, so he will be joining us. We just got to do the wrestling section there.
Okay. Let me see if I can get the right presentation up here now. It seems to be problematic.
I will keep whiffling because I've got 1,000 stories about going inside those match fixing gangs that Nick was talking about. And let me just finish this one anecdote, Jeffrey. When I was inside those gangs, even now when I speak to some of those people who are still my contacts, they spend more time trying to figure out how to make sure the gambling market isn't aware of what they're doing than actually figuring out how to bribe the coaches, the players, the team officials, the referees. They find that remarkably easy. It's all the strategies that they do. And there's a very big chap in China who used to be an MIT doctoral student working on this issue, working with them. So they've got some top brains working on that. Jeffrey, do you still need? Brilliant.
Okay.
Jeffrey, you're ready to go.
Are we up? Can you see that?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so just as a preface, thank you, Declan, for inviting me. I am a university clinician. I'm a psychologist, as well as doing research in the area of gambling for now over 30 years. And I've been very fortunate to have worked with the NCAA now for 20 years on their studies that have looked at problem gambling amongst college student athletes, as well as how we can begin to help and mitigate some of the problems they're experiencing. But clearly, as Nicholas brought up, the U.S. protection unconstitutional in 2018, and since then there's been a rush by states to legalize gambling, and most recently Georgia just, North Carolina just put into legislation their ability to do sports wagering. In 2023, legal sports over $10 billion in revenue. And more than 6 million people in the US are currently struggling with a gambling disorder. What we know is that sports wagering is normalized, accessible, and easily available. And I'm going to show you some data from some recent studies. The NCAA study done recently in April of 2023 amongst 18 to 22-year-olds found that 58% of youth participated in at least and engaged in sports betting. 51% of women engaged in sports betting, and 4% gamble daily, and almost 10% are gambling on a weekly basis. Another study done by Siena College found that 39% of Americans bet on sports, and 19% have an online sports betting account. And obviously that increases with respect to males versus females. And 15% know someone with a sports betting problem. And finally, the study I want to talk about a little bit is the study done by Leah Nauer and her colleagues at Rutgers University in the state of New Jersey. They did a statewide study where they found that 19% of adults were actively engaged in sports wagering. 19% overall had some gambling-related problems. 9% had serious problems. And when you look at sports gamblers, 35% of those individuals had moderate or serious problems. And Keith White from the National Council on Problem Gambling has been known to say that sports wagering represents the largest and fastest expansion of gambling in the US history. And Dr. Tim Fong at UCLA says, we have moved from what was once considered sin and vice to an activity embedded at every level of American culture down to kindergarten. So I want to look at some of the risk factors for an individual experiencing sports gambling. We know from the NCAA studies that we've done in the past, every 4 years, and our most people who are gambling and experiencing gambling problems tend to be young, and they tend to be more prone to be males than females. But I'm not going to go through this, as I know you can read to these in order to wagering. So what are some of the concerns that I have with respect to sports gambling? The first thing that we know is that calls to gambling helplines throughout the United States. These are helplines where people with gambling problems or loved ones who have a husband or a wife or a mother or a father who have a gambling problem, these helpline calls are surging. And they're surging predominantly because of newly introduced sports wagering in their state. We know that live in-play wagering is an important component. So what previously, 2 decades ago, was that sports wagering was what we refer to as form of gambling. You placed your wager in the beginning of the game, you waited to the end of the game, and you now saw the outcome of the game and the results of your wager. Unfortunately, now you could do this all the time. So it's gone from a discontinuous form of gambling to a continuous form of gambling. And if you want to make an analogy and think about that, think about a slot machine where you could just sit there and press that button or pull that handle continuously over time. And that is one of the major problems that we're seeing in sports wagering. We know that propositional bets, and Nicholas was talking about the integrity of students and playing times. Well, you could bet on a wide variety of different things, and it becomes really important to monitor what is going on during the game, because student athletes can actually try to alter the outcome of their wager without altering the outcome of the game per se. So they could bet against themselves or fouling out on the game while their team is still winning. And so they don't let their team down, but yet they're able to engage in more forms of gambling. We know there's an increasing number of shows and blogs devoted to sports gambling. And this is, becoming more and more of a problem because young people are very attuned to these blogs, these YouTube channels, and these sports handicapping shows. We know that there's massive advertising that's being done now with respect to gambling and sports gambling in particular. We have companies like BetMGM. We have companies like FanDuel, DraftKings spending hundreds of millions of dollars advertising gambling and gambling opportunities in order to attract clients to their site. We have celebrity endorsements for young people. And so we have, this is just an example from DraftKings, but you can look at FanDuel, you could look at MGM Grand as well. And what you see is that these endorsements by celebrities are attracting more and more young people. We also know that college student athletes can earn money by endorsing casinos. And there are other ongoing challenges. Nicholas talked about the integrity of the game. This becomes critical for the NCAA. They're also concerned about the mental health of individuals who are negatively impacted. What about the student who now goes into a deep depression, who has mental health issues as a result? And so ultimately, I think what we need to do is to begin to focus much more in terms of prevention. And we know that the NCAA is doing at least some efforts towards that, where they're going in and talking to teams in order to help try to minimize match fixing, but also the mental health of individuals who are student athletes. So the question is, this comes from the New York Times, sports gambling gold rush is on, and should we be concerned? And the answer, I believe, is yes. We really need to be concerned about our student athletes. I think we need to be concerned about gambling in general. We know that there's a growing population of individuals who are experiencing gambling and gambling-related problems. Gambling betting or gambling wagering and gambling problems are not single trial learning. You don't get a problem the first time you do it. It's a progressive disorder. And more individuals are betting more and more money. And this is aptly, not only is it March Madness season, but it's also March is Problem Gambling Awareness Month. It's a time in which we really need to identify ways in which we can try to minimize gambling problems amongst our young people. Thank you.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for that. I know you were having some connection issues. I apologize to anyone listening in that missed that. I had my screen and video muted because I was wrestling, trying to bring in a superstar of the professional gambling world. We've joined by Ed Fang. Ed, thank you so much for coming in. We're going to listen to one other panelist and then come to you in about 12 minutes. When, and there will be, when the Hollywood movie comes to be made, there's a plethora of people whose stories on this particular panel could be told. One of them is Harry Levant. I was caught as I was writing last night his introduction, whether I should tell you Harry's story, because it is one of the most dramatic and one of the most telling and humane and humanly touched stories. I actually don't think it's my job to. I don't think it's my role to take words and to take Harry's story out. But I can assure you that this is a man who has paid the price of gambling addiction, who has turned himself around, has turned his life around, and is now fighting as a single-minded crusader to make sure that his experiences are not replicated and not repeated by as many people as he can. Harry, it is an honor to have you here. You're an eloquent fighter, and it's really, really wonderful to share a panel with you. The floor is yours.
Declan, the privilege and pleasure is all mine. I'm touched by your very kind words, and I hope to do them justice over the next 12 minutes.
You will.
It has been said that it takes me 10 minutes to clear my throat, so I will do my best to make the throat clearing part the small part of the presentation and have much more interesting substantive things to report. But before I do, I want to just take a minute and thank the other panelists for the opportunity and thank the Drake Group for the privilege of being on this panel today. And, before we got started, Jeff and I were having a little pop culture discussion about the rock band The Eagles and the song Hotel California. I'm going to take Jeff pointed out to me that only old people like me might know that reference. So Jeff, as I approach a milestone birthday in a couple of weeks, I take your comment with all love and affection, but I'm going to take another shot at a pop culture reference because I think it's important. The last time a Professor Hill came to town and warned of impending trouble, it was only a pool table being delivered to River City, Iowa. Now we have a much larger problem. And fortunately, we have, again, a Professor Hill coming to town to warn people about the impending, what I believe is a public health crisis. But against those words, what I'm going to try and do over the next 11 minutes is discuss the issue of sports gambling as it relates particularly to the NCAA and college students, college athletes, from a public health perspective, because we hear with great regularity the words responsible gaming. Responsible gaming places the onus on the individual, places the blame on the individual. This is an issue about a known addictive product, and we have, in less than 6 years since the Murphy case was decided, seen a building public health emergency, and that's the perspective I hope to bring to this. And Declan, you're right. 10 years ago right now, I know where I was at 2:44 Eastern time. 10 years ago right now, I was in a casino self-destructing and planning my own suicide, because 10 years ago, April 27th, 2014, I made my last bet, and I survived a suicide attempt that night related to my gambling addiction. And I also hurt a lot of people in addition to myself. Gambling addiction doesn't just impact the person who struggles with the condition, it impacts countless people around them, children, relatives, family, friends, coworkers, community. And I never lose sight of the fact that I hurt many people who trusted me and loved me, because the people I stole from were my clients and my family and my friends. I am, in fact, among other things, a disbarred lawyer because I used other people's money to fund my gambling disorder. And I also recall very vividly, and want to share with everyone listening, that in February of 2015, I stood in a courtroom in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I had practiced law for more than 2 decades, where my father had practiced law for nearly 5 decades before me. And I pled guilty to my financial crimes in February of 2015. And on the day of my sentencing, in the presence of my children, my clients and family whom I had hurt, and the court itself, I made a pledge that if I could get well from my gambling disorder, I would use my experience and any training I would obtain to try and prevent other people from suffering the same fate. And I use the word prevent because, and you'll hear that throughout my presentation, this is an issue of prevention, because the best form of treatment for gambling addiction is to prevent it in the first place. And now I am privileged 10 years later to be an internationally certified gambling addiction counselor. I went back to school and got a master's in counseling psychology. I subspecialty as an internationally certified gambling counselor. I run the gambling treatment program and Ethos Treatment in Philadelphia. And maybe most important of all, I'm the gambling policy advisor to the Public Health Advocacy Institute at Northeastern University, where I'm now pursuing a doctorate, where I have the privilege to serve under Professor Richard Daynard and Professor Mark Gottlieb. And Professor Daynard, as many public health folks know, is the person who single-handedly brought the public health approach to tobacco. And what we're seeing with gambling is the same playbook followed by the gambling industry that the tobacco industry used in the 50s and 60s. And it's a public health approach that's needed to address it. So I briefly mentioned the idea of responsible gaming. Where does this come from? Well, in the early 2000s, knowing that the gambling industry wanted to expand, the industry wasn't going to just cede all expansion to Native American tribes. The industry recognized that there was a problem afoot. Gambling disorder had been recognized in DSM-3 in 1980 as an impulse control disorder. There's something wrong with Sally or Tommy. They can't control themselves, categorized very similar to kleptomania. The onus was placed on the individual to behave responsibly. And what the gambling industry did is they paid for a series of research studies that inside our business are known as the Reno model. And the Reno model studies stand for the proposition that government and the gambling industry have a duty to advise people about the potential risk of harm. But each individual must ultimately be responsible for their own decisions. And oh, by the way, for those poor, unfortunate few, the industry suggests it's less than 1% of gamblers, the industry says we will put up money to pay for their treatment. The moral equivalent of big tobacco saying, allow us to market our cigarettes however we like, as long as we pay for chemotherapy and hospice. We wouldn't tolerate it with tobacco, yet it's the way states and organizations, including the NCAA, approach gambling as a responsible gaming issue. But, you know, science has a way of catching up. And in 2013, medical science said, wait a minute, we had this one all wrong with calling this an impulse control disorder. And in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association, followed very shortly thereafter by the World Health Organization and the International Classification of Diseases, said, wait a minute, gambling is a known addictive product, and gambling disorder is an addiction on the same level as heroin and opioids and tobacco and alcohol and cocaine. So if
You're halfway through, Ed.
Thank you.
Harry, sorry, you're halfway through.
Understood. If we are dealing with a known addictive product, the answer should not be place the onus on the individual, it should just be responsible. The onus should be on regulating the distribution of a product in a way to make it as safe as possible. And that public health model has yet to take hold in the United States. But if the work we're doing at the Public Health Advocacy Institute, or when I should say, it takes hold, here are some changes that we can see. And recently, we've seen Governor Baker, the new president of the NCAA, make some initial efforts to address. And if you could enable my screen share at this moment, I would appreciate it. I'm going to need it in about a minute. We've seen Governor Baker make some efforts to bring a little bit of reform. They're asking states to no longer accept proposition wagers on the actions of individual student athletes. But that's all we've seen so far. Meanwhile, we're seeing significant warning signs that the betting industry, its partners in media, state governments themselves, the largest media companies, and what we're seeing a warning sign of are the college conferences themselves are about to take collegiate sports betting to another more dangerous level, and allow me to elaborate. While I applaud Governor Baker for the calls to eliminate proposition betting with individual athletes, I ask folks to take note of what we very quietly seen with what we call the Big Five conferences. And let's focus for just a moment on the Big Ten. The Big Ten, as we all know, has always been the Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, Illinois. Next season, we're going to see in the Big Ten, USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington are now in the Big Ten. Why? Not because the West Coast suddenly moved into the Midwest. Those schools are coming into the Big Ten because they're going to create from noon till midnight football games within that conference. We see in the Southeast Conference, Texas and Oklahoma. Why? I'm going to tell you why. And again, looking at the Big Ten. The Big Ten has signed a contract with a company known as Sports Radar to be their exclusive data provider. And what we are on the verge of seeing are the conferences themselves selling their data to the gambling companies for what's called in-game micro betting, so that every shot in a basketball game, every snap in a football game, every micro event becomes a gambling opportunity. And as Jeffrey was talking about, this is a known addictive product. What's the single most significant warning sign of a potential problem? The chasing of additional action. Gambling addiction is not about money. It's about the way the product makes people feel. And the more action people can get, the more trouble they get into. So I asked if I could share my screen. I'm going to take a real quick shot in about the 90 seconds I have left and show you right now, right this very second. Please don't be halftime. Good. It's not halftime. This is a screenshot. If you can, hopefully, if someone on the panel can just give me a thumbs up that you can see my betting screen right now. Thank you. I have put up for you the betting screen live and in action of St. John's and Seton Hall in the Big Ten tournament. While there's no betting on individual props, look what you can bet on. You can bet on the next field goal by either team. Will it be a 2-point field goal? Will it be a 3-point field goal? You can scroll down even further. You can bet the type of shot. And if I go even further into what's called game props, you can wager on the number of points the game will be won by. You can wager on whether each team's score, looking at the bottom, will be odds or even. This is before the conferences expand and expand to include in-game micro betting. And make no mistake that it's coming, because it is the most profitable partnership between the gambling companies, the sports leagues and teams. And in this case, while the NCAA is making an effort, the conferences have realigned themselves for profitability, and they will be selling their data to the gambling industry for micro betting. This is the single biggest threat, not just to the public, but to the athletes themselves. I believe that was the 1 minute, Declan. Not just to the public, but to the athletes themselves. Think about the scenario. We are literally going to have a scenario where in June, an athlete is attending their senior prom. And in September, they're kicking or attempting to kick a field goal worth hundreds of millions of dollars in micro betting. And I'm going to take one last shot. I don't want you to believe just my words. I'm going to take a shot at one more screen share in the 15 seconds that I have left. And I'm afraid that I may have inadvertently taken this one down. I did. So I will stop screen sharing and simply tell you that the NCAA's policy, the NCAA is opposed to gambling, but the member conferences are free to do what they like. And if we don't start looking at this from a prevention model, we are going to have a problem, and we can't put that genie back in the bottle. Thank you for including me, Declan. A pleasure to be on the panel.
Thank you, Harry. I love that final word of the genie out of the bottle. Just to be very clear, everybody's perspective is their own. It's not the Drake Group's, it's not Declan Hill's. And I really want to lay that down because we're going to do pretty much a 180 change here. We're going to go to the man I call Professor Ed. He got his PhD from Stanford. He was roommates or at least floor mates with some of the guys that set up and originated Google. He is a genius. Many of my contacts in this world, Jeffrey, are professional gamblers. I have a huge amount of respect for them because they're the hardest working people that I know. And I've asked Ed to come along to this. He is going to have a different perspective, I think, from Harry and Nick and Jeffrey and Tim. And we don't care. I want Ed to speak out about how difficult it is to be a successful gambler. There is a tidal wave of commercials going across telling our young people that all you got to do is throw some cash in the game and you'll be able to win. And so, Ed, it's a great honor to have you here. I know your perspective is going to be different, but I really, really welcome this opportunity for you to speak about what it's like to be a professional gambler and how you work. Thank you, Ed.
Declan, thank you so much for having me. And yes, this is going to be about as much of a 180-degree right turn as I can possibly imagine. My sports betting journey started when I told my mentor at Berkeley that his research sucked. This was back in 2005, 2006. Turns out that it's not a good idea to tell your mentor that his research sucks. I got my PhD from Stanford in chemical engineering. And before I went to Berkeley, I'd done this short postdoc at the University of California, Santa Barbara, doing polymer physics. And then I went to Berkeley on a Miller Fellowship. And this was a prestigious fellowship. Academia had kind of anointed me that I was going to be one of the next great professors in academia. It's a little bit like being a lottery pick in the NBA. Academia says that you have a lot of upside. But then I clashed with my mentor in my research, and that was basically the end of my academic career. In reality, I didn't want to play the publish or perish game. Looking back at it, it seems naive and actually a little bit arrogant, but that's what happened to me. And in that lottery pick, I became Stromile Swift. Academia did leave me with a number of math skills, and that was pretty important into getting into sports betting. It was around 2008, I started digging into a paper on Google's PageRank algorithm. And it was pretty fascinating to me because it was the same math that was what I did in my research at Stanford. It was the mathematics of Markov chains, and it talked about calculating the stationary distribution of those Markov chains for those of you with a math background. And I thought this was really interesting. Instead of building a billion-dollar unicorn of a company, I thought, well, let's apply these ideas to sports. So I use these basic ideas about Markov chains and stationary distributions and develop an algorithm to rank teams and to predict the outcome of games. All right, I started with some NFL because it was the easiest way to get some data and start doing some rankings, send an email to some friends, and people were interested in that. I did college football next because what my algorithm does is it adjusts for strength of schedule. So it says it's much more difficult to play in the Big Ten in football than it is to play in the MAC. The math simply says adjust for that. And then that first year that I was doing things, I was talking to a friend and he advised me to do some college basketball. And I said, nah, I don't really want to do that. There's already this guy, Ken Pomeroy, out there doing college basketball analytics. But my friend insisted, and I did, and that proved to be some pretty good advice because March Madness has been an important part of my journey since I started working in sports analytics and sports betting. So just briefly how my algorithm works in predicting March Madness. Like I said, it calculates team rankings. I'm taking the margin of victory in games, and I'm adjusting for strength of schedule. Over the past 15 tournaments, the higher ranked team has won 69.7 games. So that is pretty good. And I think pretty much shows the power of predictive analytics, what can happen when you apply math to predicting the outcome of these sporting events. Also, the champion has been ranked first or second in my pre-tournament rankings in 9 of the past 15 tournaments as well. And this is pretty important because the champion is worth the most points when you're filling out your bracket. So you can check out all that at thepowerrank.com. But we're here to talk about sports betting. And my entry into sports betting came a lot later. Tim Lawson runs the Better Life podcast, and he had me on, and he asked about what was your first betting experience? And I wasn't one of those kids that was taking bets from friends in high school or anything like that. Like my first real kind of memory of thinking about betting was when I was at Stanford. and I heard that another physics grad student had put his PhD on hold to go play poker as a pro. And my thought was, that could never be me. I grew up in a household that had the importance, everything. What was important was tests and grades, and anything like poker and advantage play or sports betting was less left to the street smart folks. So, I had this algorithm, but I wasn't necessarily using it for betting. And then, slowly events happened that got me more into the betting world. It was about 2012 where I met my friend Mike Craig, and he informed me that he was using my college football numbers to bet on games. At this point, I still really wasn't betting that much. And from 2012 until what PASPA is repealed, that entire time I'm betting a little bit more every year, but really I'm running my site, the Power Rank. I'm making my living that way. A lot of things changed with legalization. In Michigan, that happened in March of 2020. Yes, not exactly the best time to legalize sports betting with COVID and all, but that's what happened in our state. And now, my activities are kind of split equally between running my site and then betting with my partners. Mike is one of my partners. And, it was interesting. Like he never, he was never like, hey, you should really do this with us. It was nice because he slowly, he was just like, hey, this opportunity is always available. And at some point, much later after I met him, I took up that opportunity to be betting with him. The thing about betting and betting for a significant part of your income is that the environment shifts every year. Things are constantly changing in the markets. And this might seem annoying, but it has actually become the aspect of my job that I like the most. Just as a basic example, before legalization in the US, maybe about 8-9 years ago, most professional bettors would be betting sides and totals.
Halfway through, Ed. Halfway through.
Excellent. So these are brave souls that will take on markets like the NFL, so NFL spreads and totals. College football as well is obviously another big market. But college basketball is a market in which a lot of future pros kind of end up like getting their feet wet. College basketball is easier to beat in November and December. And you can, if you just do the work, try to find those edges, you can bet enough to kind of work your way to the point where you can become a professional. Now, after legalization, there are so many more markets. And the way that this has changed is now you can get enough money down to make significant money on markets that aren't those primary markets, those sides and totals. And the one I'll talk about just briefly here is NFL player props. You can get it enough down to make it worth it. 3 hours before the kickoff of the Super Bowl, FanDuel would have taken $5,000 on an NFL player prop. And this is on my limited account. So the way things work on FanDuel is, you can, if you go to a FanDuel, you can type in a number and you just type in 1 million, for instance, right? And it'll tell you what the max bet is, which is kind of nice. And then when I log in, you can tell what my limit is, and it's essentially 1/10 of that, right? So at this point, FanDuel is confident enough in their Super Bowl props market that they're willing to take 50,000 from a regular customer. So this gives you an idea, like that's how the market has changed. So FanDuel really thinks that their pricing is good enough on a market like Deebo Samuel receiving yards that they're willing to take a lot of money on it. And this is an opportunity for, professionals to get down. The market for the Super Bowl has gotten a lot sharper. 5-8 years ago, you would hear these stories of professional bettors just killing it with Super Bowl props, betting the under on every single one. It's not as easy anymore. And that's why FanDuel's taking bigger limits. But in general, these player props are a little bit easier to beat. There's some other markets out there in the NFL. They're not necessarily player props, but it's something that me and my partners had a lot of good fortune with this past season. You can get a lot down, but the pricing's just off because there's just so many of these markets to cover. What is the problem trying to make a living betting? Well, I already mentioned it before. It's the limiting of accounts. So as an extreme example, our group had an account with a sports book that rhymes with daft. The account became worthless after 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It had the same limits of an account that I've been betting on for a couple of years. So that's kind of what it's like these days. What do these limits look like? So I have an account at a sports book, and I wanted to bet Jose Ramirez to win AL MVP this year. This was a suggestion from a pro bettor that I listened to on a particular podcast that I particularly like. And I was allowed to bet $6.06. So I was allowed to bet $6.06. So that's kind of what it looks like on my account. This requires a little bit of context. This is a pretty high odds bet. It's a 25 to 1. But still, that $6.06 pays out $157.56. So that's not exactly putting any kind of dent into a big modern sports book, but these are the types of limits that you deal with. If you are trying to bet as a pro, like what does your life look like? Well, you're trying to get more accounts, right? You're trying to get more accounts to get more money down on the bets that you want to make. That requires talking to people that you know, talking to people that you trust, sitting down with them, explaining what's going on, explaining to them how we're going to deal with taxes, so on and so forth. It's kind of boring, but that's what you need to do to be successful. I mean, it's almost like defining the edge, and all the math and stuff is, I mean, it's certainly a part of it, and it's certainly what I'm particularly good at, but it's a small part of making a living in this world. There are a lot of opportunities out there. If you're looking to get into this and finding an edge.
Last minute.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so I just want to end with just the main point that I've learned being in the industry for over a decade. Sports betting is always changing. You better change with it, or you're going to get crushed. School and academia does not teach you how to deal with these real world with this real world type of situation. I personally remember a professor in academia that had this computational method, and he was really proud of it. And he went around and he tried to find problems to solve with it. If you do that in the sports betting world, it won't work. You have to solve real world problems. So anyways, you really have to adapt. And I think that's really what the sports world teaches you. You need to adapt, and you need to be flexible. When I'm looking at new markets, there's oftentimes that I don't even use the model, and you just have to adapt.
Ed, I'm going to cut you off there. Thank you so much. I just want to be absolutely respectful for both our listeners and for everybody on the panel. I love the fact you've come in and changed the perspective 180 degrees. I love the diversity that we're having on this panel. I'm going to share an anecdote. A very close friend of mine and colleague of mine was one of the world's best and top sports bookmakers. And I once asked him how many customers he had. And he said, this is the days before 2018. And he said, I have about maybe 1 million people who bet with me. I'm like, oh, that's cool. How many of those guys win? And he's what, year over year? And I'm like, yeah, January 1st to December 31st. And he goes, I don't know, maybe 5. And I'm like, you mean 5,000? He goes, no, 5. Like, I'm counting them on my fingers, because that's how few Ed Fangs there are in the world. I know as one of the top ranked academics who walked away from it. Ed, you think this is easy, but it's really, really difficult what you do. And just the numbers that you've thrown out and the way you're talking, I think, illustrates that point. And also that point that you're saying is the more successful you get as a professional gambler, the more difficult it is to actually place a bet. Many bookmakers are very happy to take losing bets and people that they know are going to lose. But as soon as you start bidding a series of wins, it's going to get more and more difficult. Ed, thank you. We're going to return to you in the questions after our final presentation today with probably America's most famous gambling addict. This is a friend and colleague of mine, Tim Donaghy. For those of you who don't know Tim's story, It's really a tragic one. It's an Icarus. As a younger man, Tim was one of the NBA's top-ranked referees and officials. He got himself caught up in gambling addiction. We'll speak about that in 1 second. And he really effectively threw it all away. So, Tim, I'm wondering if we could walk our way through your story and then get a sense of your perspective on the challenges facing the NCAA. Tim, thank you for
Sure.
joining us.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, I was an NBA basketball referee for 13 years. And once I started making some good money, I joined a country club and started playing golf and hanging out the country club with guys, and got hooked on gambling on everything from golf to blackjack at the casinos to uh, big money card games in people's basements. And one day, a good friend of mine from the country club asked for me to pick a couple winners for him in the NBA. He had the Philadelphia Daily News. I picked 3 games for him because I had just come from home, and I looked at the master schedule of who was officiating those games. And I picked 3 games for him. And the next day he called me because all 3 won, and he was overly excited and asked me if it was that easy for me to pick winners in the NBA. And I told him it was, because of relationships that existed between referees and players, referees and coaches, and referees and owners. And it spilled out onto the floor, and the line sometimes could be 5, 6, or 7 points off. So with that, we started betting on NBA games and anything that we could bet on together. And eventually, when I had information on an NBA game that I was officiating, I would pass that along to him. And he took that and was placing bets and behind my back, passing that along to people associated with organized crime. So after we did it for 3 years and I wanted to stop, um, I wasn't going to stop, because these guys in the mob that were getting these plays wanted to continue to get them and picked me up outside of a Marriott hotel in Philadelphia and threatened me. And I decided to continue to give them the picks, and it was heard over a Gambino wiretap. And the whole thing was discovered. And before you know it, the FBI was all over the place. And, I became a cooperating witness for the FBI against the cultural fraud in the NBA and organized crime. And with that, I pled guilty to gambling and wire fraud and was sentenced to 15 months in prison.
What Harry and Jeffrey spoke very, very poignantly about addiction, and let's walk our way through that story that you've told. We can unpack this for hours, quite frankly. But first of all, could you talk a little bit about the effect of your gambling addiction on your family?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a contract with the NBA that said I couldn't place a bet of any kind, but yet, I was constantly on the golf course. I was constantly at the casinos, and I was constantly playing cards, which, at the time I had 4 daughters. And when I was on the road as an NBA referee, I was going 28 days a month. And when I was home, I was gambling on the golf course or gambling at the casino. So, definitely took a toll on my wife and my 4 daughters because I was never around. And the highs and lows of winning and losing, and your temperament when you do that, is not good to be around, family atmosphere. So it was just a disaster all the way around, from, the way I treated people when you would lose, the highs of when you would win. And then, of course, how it affected my family when I ended up losing my job and, going from the best of everything to, trying to figure out how you're going to support your children.
Tim, since the Netflix documentary about the scandal associated around you, there's been an elephant in the room, which is, did you match fix? Did you deliberately change your refereeing decision in the NBA games that you were overseeing?
And that was a big thing with the FBI, was that they wanted me to say that I fixed games. But after reviewing all the tapes, they realized that I didn't, that what I was doing was just enforcing what the NBA wanted the 3 referees to enforce during the course of that game. And it would change from, game to game, to city to city. And the 3 of us as referees would go out there and force those rules that they wanted us to concentrate on that night. And it would put a team at a major advantage or disadvantage. And I was passing that information along to people, associated with organized crime that were making these bets. And it wasn't like I was going out and putting Shaquille O'Neal to the bench with 4 quick fouls or a star player so that that team would lose. So after they did their investigation and realized that it was the way it was set up by the NBA, they began to understand it.
No, I realize, and we're going to get to the NCAA, but there's one kind of another elephant hanging over the media at the moment, and that is the allegations last week when a top NBA player made a gesture at one of the referees. I know that you're long past, you haven't got anything to do with the NBA, but what was your perspective when you saw that story?
I think the NBA continues to have a problem that the rules aren't officiated as they're written in the rule book. They're really officiated based on the names on the front and the back of the jerseys. And until they start to enforce the rules as they're written in the rule book fairly for everybody, and there's that gray area, there's always going to be a player or a coach or an owner that feels that they're getting screwed, and they're getting screwed because somebody's doing something for monetary gain.
So your perspective, your opinion, obviously you're a disgruntled ex-employee, but your perspective is that the NBA is heading towards entertainment rather than sport.
Well, the NBA is an entertainment company, and if you look at the end of any NBA game, it says NBA Entertainment at the bottom of it, and that's why they're allowed to do anything they want and dictate to the referees what to call, when to call it, because it is an entertainment company, and that's why they weren't really charged with anything with the NBA scandal, was because it's a form of entertainment, and they can put that entertainment on any way they want.
Again, I go back to this thing that's your opinion as a disgruntled ex-employee. If the NBA were here, I'm sure they'd say many things differently. We're halfway through our session, Tim. Let's talk about the NCAA. What's your view in terms of the NCAA and sports gambling? Are they in the crosshairs?
I think they're definitely in a situation where they're ripe for a major problem sooner than later. I think you have a lot of these kids that aren't going to the NBA or to the NFL, and somebody's going to offer them a large sum of money to win a game, but not win by what the point spread is. So in their mind, they're not doing anything wrong if the spread's 15 and they only win by 10. And the bet can cash and their team still won. I think you're going to find somebody that's going to do that, and they're going to do that for a sum of money to where they can help support their family, because down the road, they're not going to be one of these players that is going to make money, at the professional level.
Did you see, at one point in your career, you were working in the NCAA. Do you see a similar issue with officials in the NCAA as in some of the professional sport league that exist, in your opinion?
No, I never refed in the NCAA, but I have a lot of friends that ref there and watched it a lot. No, I see them, not favoring, the star players or, the bigger teams. I see the rules being officiated based on how they're written in the rule book. So, I don't see that as a form of entertainment to where they're trying to, have a situation where teams are running up and down the floor and there's, big scores in a game. It's totally different from the NBA. The NBA is something where it's kind of a show to where they want high scoring, and they want these big dunks, and they want people to, sit there and love the fact that the star players are scoring a lot of points. But, in the NCAA, they're treated, in calls based on how they're written in the rule book.
So, as far as your perspective on this, is that the challenge that the NCAA is going to have is because they have a bunch of unpaid players who are never actually going to be able to break into the professional league.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if not everyone's getting this NIL money, and there is a situation where people have to support their family. They're going to say, how am I going to get mine? And it's going to be an opportunity where someone's going to present this to them, and they're going to take it. And I do want to add just real quick, I'm really not a disgruntled NBA employee, because I know what I did was wrong. I enjoyed my job there. I love the job. I love the people I worked for. But, there was a way that they wanted the referees to do certain things. And, it was quite obvious that the FBI investigated this and said that I told the truth at every turn. And there have been some changes, but, I still see things that they do where they treat these bigger market teams and these star players, better than what they treat other people.
Tim, I'm going to turn now to the questions. We've got a bunch of questions in the chat here, and we've only got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to kick off. What's, in terms of NIL, in terms of the image licensing that many of the NCAA players are getting, surely that will change the equation. Surely that will make it less likely that there will be match fixing in the NCAA going on. And that's a shout out to Michael Funk, who's been trying to ask that question or get that question raised for the last few minutes.
No, I don't think so. I think it would make it, a situation where the kid that's not getting that NIL money at a lower division school is going to be the one that's saying everybody else is getting paid. I have to get mine. So, there's lines on these schools that you really never have heard of. So there's always going to be an opportunity for one of these kids at one of these lower Division I schools that isn't getting the money that they think that they deserve, that are going to do something and unfortunately probably take that money and do what they shouldn't be doing.
Thank you. Nick, I'm going to turn to you. Do you have a perspective on this? Have you been following the debate around NIL and the NCAA, and now that the students are allowed to receive money from their image?
Yeah, I do, and thanks for the question. Look, I mean, the image around amateur athletics is what we really need to unpack. As I was sort of mentioning, in terms of the ability to buy off professional players that aren't making a lot of money, the fact that college athletes have been now termed as employees, and they're entitled to, what Tim said, the right to get theirs, is a game changer. And it's something that we need to understand goes all the way back to the recruitment of how they got to the schools. It goes back to all of the big level money that Jeffrey was talking about on realignment. It comes back to the business aspect of big college athletics. And I really think that the role of NIL is something that is going to eat at the very heart of the integrity of the sport.
Jeff, thank you, Nick. Jeffrey, I'm going to turn to you now. And what, in 1 minute or less, is the solution that the NCAA should be approaching this challenge now? Oh, and you're on mute. Still on.
I think the big
Yep, there we
issue
go.
is prevention. I think we really need to do a lot more preventative work. But the other thing about prevention is beyond the NCAA. When you look at the NCAA data, where college student athletes are gambling, and you ask them the question, when did you begin gambling? They all say at the high school level. So it's not something new as soon as they get to college.
Harry, how much have you seen? Sorry, Jeffrey, you just cut off there again. Harry, I'm going to ask you that question specifically with addiction. How much education is there in American universities about gambling addiction?
There's precious little, but Declan, I worry about this idea that we can educate our way out of this. In the 1980s, I have no doubt that First Lady Nancy Reagan meant well with just say no to drugs. It was an abject failure.
Right.
The NCAA does do an education program, but they don't advocate for prevention by eliminating the most harmful type of products. And there's one simple thing we could do right now that would prevent a significant amount of harm, and that's affordability checks. I just hospitalized a patient the other day. This person turned 21 in November. They lost over $70,000 between November and the end of February. This same patient makes $8.50 an hour and works 20 hours a week. That's a $200 a week salary. And they were permitted by the gambling industry to lose $71,000. If government were to step in, and we've talked a little bit about the Murphy case, in that Supreme Court opinion, it specifically notes that Congress is free to regulate this issue. If we had affordability checks, we wouldn't eliminate all harm, but we would catch a great deal of it. And my position is, rather than educating, we need to create guardrails so people don't fall in the river in the first place. What we're doing right now is we're fishing them out after they've been drowning. That's simply the opposite of a public health approach, and it's the opposite of prevention.
Your thoughts, Harry, on the Iowa and Iowa State situation? Were you following that?
I was a bit. I worry, much like Nick was talking about. These types of things are only the ones we're seeing in the media now. They're already happening. They're happening. They're happening because it's built in as part of the model when there's this much betting. So what I was trying to demonstrate with a quick look at the gambling website. There is so much gambling that it's already going to impact. We just don't know how much. And right now, everyone is still in the delightful stage of becoming addicted, that is, state governments are, to the revenue. No one has yet done what Jeff started to talk about, say, wait a minute, before we fall in love with the revenue, let's go back and look at how we make this product as safe as possible. I am not opposed to gambling. I'm opposed to the system that exists today.
The unregulated gambling that you have in many states. Some states good, some states not so good. I see a question from Mike Seeley. This will be the second last question. Ed, it's going out to you. Ed, what percentage of pro gamblers bet with offshore books because they're limited to $6 on DraftKings, for example? I don't know whether that's true if they're limited to $6 on DraftKings, but how many of your colleagues in pro gambling have switched now to offshore bookmaking?
The pros that have been doing this for a long time have offshore accounts. So I would say the vast majority. I actually don't, and I would probably be one of the minority that doesn't have an offshore account.
And I'm going to return to you, Ed, because there's on this day in the last there's another elephant hanging in the room. So Ed, I'm going to give you the last question to you. But before that, Jeffrey, hopefully your line is better. This one is from Megan Poliquin. Just in 1 minute, what are your recommendations for treatment, prevention, outreach regarding sports betting? As a gambling counselor myself, I'm looking to reach this population the best I can. Harry, I know you addressed that, but I want to see if Jeffrey can address that one.
Yeah, I think the first thing is problem gamblers is not a homogeneous group of people. So it's important to remember that they're individuals with different issues, and one has to look at that. What we've done is try to take examples for individuals who have sports gambling problems, say, listen, here are people who are student athletes who are better than them. How are you going to be able to address?
Jeffrey, I'm so sorry. We're having real problems because it's coming in staccato. I'm very sorry about this. I'll cut this one short because we're in our last minute. Nick, I see you have a question, and then I'm going to ask a facetious question, but a serious one to Ed Fang. Nick.
Just to let you know, and this is not to give Ed any ideas, but I had a very good close colleague check on the availability of today's NCAA games in Asia, and all of them were available on SingBet. So just everybody be ready.
Harry.
Definitely 5 seconds, just for Megan's question. I run an intensive outpatient psychotherapy program, Megan. I use group therapy at the beginning because so many gamblers feel isolated and alone. I put small groups together, and that's the starting point for me to help with that overwhelming feeling of isolation in early treatment.
Awesome. Thank you, Harry. And I know you're available online, as is Jeffrey, for anyone who wants to reach out. Tim, thank you very much. I know it can be painful to discuss these issues over and over again. Nicholas, we're honored to have you here. Jeffrey, Harry, thank you. I'm going to end, Mazzy, by asking the question that many of our audience wants to know. Ed, who will win March Madness?
The odds are going to favor UConn.
Okay.
I think they're
On
the
that-
most complete team.
All right. I'm not going to do